We'll learn about Margaret Thatcher and learn about whether she was misunderstood. Okay, as I've said, you know, Margaret Thatcher is a very, very divisive figure, you know, being known as a milk snatcher, toilet brush, as my mother would call her. That's my mother. And she's really, really divided the country. In the north, people were raving in the streets when she died. In the south, you know, they were crying into their champagne flutes. And she really is somebody who has completely polarised public opinion. And so we're going to start off with a clip from Spitting Image, which is a satire programme in the 1980s and 1990s, which tended to make fun of her quite a lot.
Another day over, and a few moments of peace together. Look at me, white.
Okay, so this is Spitting Image.
Another day over, and a few moments of peace to gather strength. Look at me. White cheeks, sunken eyes, wrinkles. I'm getting old and ugly.
How dare you call me old and ugly?
Who, you?
There's two sides to your personality, Margaret. The nasty, evil side,
And then me.
even more nasty, evil side.
That's terrible. I'll have to pay 2 poll taxes.
I'm sick of you staring in the mirror like a moaning ninny going on about how the country's going down the pan.
But it's true.
What about your wartime hero? Did he falter when things got tough?
No, he topped himself in a burning bunker. And even he wasn't as though the pelt was lying out. Why is this happening to me?
Because you don't listen to people.
I mean, it's not as if I don't listen to people.
Margaret, it's Jessica. Who are you talking to?
Oh, only a stress-induced manifestation of my psychotic alter ego.
Oh, that's all right. For a minute I thought you'd gone mad. There's 4 of you.
Okay, so as you can see, you know, she's quite an easy person to make fun of, and it was there making fun of her kind of a split personality, whereby on one hand she would appear, you know, very kind of calm and collected and very feminine and gentle, and then on the other hand she could be very ruthless and she could be very cutthroat. But let's kind of go back to who Thatcher was and where she comes from. Ironically, you know, the woman who probably did the most damage to the, I suppose, the poor, was poor herself. You know, she came from quite a humble background, and her dad was a greengrocer, and was quite a kind of a strict Presbyterian dad, and he brought her up with very, very strong religious values. So as a woman, as a young person growing up, she always had a kind of a set of standards. She always had a drive that was kind of instilled into her by her dad. And she was the very first person in her family to go off to Oxford, and she read chemistry, and she was learning to be a biochemist. Okay, and she read chemistry, she did very well, she did really, really well at her degree, she worked very hard, very intelligent, very capable. Remember, you know, this is at a time where it was not normal for women to proceed quite high up. Sexism was still quite strong. When she was relatively young, she then met a lovely man called Dennis. Dennis is the guy that was in that clip there, and he remained her husband until he died, and obviously then she died a little bit later. But they were a very, very strong political couple, and it's quite a rare commodity for people to get married in politics and not have an affair and not break up, and their marriage was very, very strong. So in 1950 she decided, having done her degree in chemistry, to then go into politics, and she stood in 1950 in a by-election at the age of 23. So she was very young, she had a weird voice, she was no oil painting, but still, she was a woman standing for politics. So the odds were against her, and then obviously, of course, she lost. But that's okay, it's kind of a bit of a baptism of fire, and it kind of made her a little bit more aware about politics, and a little bit more aware about how to survive in a very male, white male, kind of middle-class dominated world. In 1959, she stood for the constituency of Finchley, and remarkably she won. And she won by using her feminine wiles. Okay, she wasn't an oil painting, but she understood her own femininity and she understood her own sexuality, which is why some feminists think that she was the greatest feminist that ever lived. Some feminists, you know, can't stand her because she used her femininity so well. She was made Minister of Education under the leader of the Conservatives at the time, which was Edward Heath, and she didn't like Edward Heath at all. She found him weak. She thought he was stuffy, and she thought he belonged to that old political class that people were getting sick of. But most importantly, she felt that he was a kind of a wet blanket. You know, he didn't stand up to the unions. He didn't stand up to the people in his party. His party were turning on each other, and she felt, as a strong woman, that she was somebody who could do the job better, and she always felt that. It wasn't so much a sense of entitlement, it was an intense sense of confidence in her own ability. So, what did she believe in? Well, it's quite difficult, I think, to put Thatcherism into a kind of a slide, really, but generally it's quite right-wing. There are left-wing elements of it, there are liberal elements of it, but we tend to put her on the right. She's not a fascist, okay? She's no Oswald Mosley or Adolf Hitler, regardless of what a lot of people in the North might tell you. But she did believe in nationalism. She did believe in this sense of being proud of your own country, of being proud of being British. And this quote just at the bottom is very much what she believed about what it was to be a good citizen. You know, she wanted to renew the spirit of the nation. At the heart of renewing the nation must be a recovery of self-confidence and self-respect. We as British people are the badass people of the planet. You know, we were the ones that created democracy. Forget the Greeks, we'll just ignore them. But we really created it. We created the colonial empire. We created the Industrial Revolution. We are the badass ones. Everyone else is just paling in significance. And we've spent far, far too long since 1900 forgetting that. As we went into decline, we forgot who we were. And I'm here to make us feel proud of being British. She would have been brilliant on the Olympics committee. She's very, very nationalistic. She also believed, quite importantly, in something called individualism. And individualism was her belief that nobody deserves a leg up, really. Because at the end of the day, she didn't get a leg up. She was a woman coming from a poor background, and she built herself up and became the Minister of Education. She didn't get any help, she didn't get any money, she did it by herself. So why should we bail people out? Why should we throw money at people in the hope that they'll use it wisely? Individualism, self-help, will give you the tools and then you use them, but we're not going to make you do it, because at the end of the day, it's laissez-faire. You know, you live by your own, and you die by your own, and you achieve by your own. And she really, really believed in that quite strongly. And you see that in a lot of her policies. You see that as we go through her political governments, and every time people say, hello, where are your social policies? What about the poor? Her answer is always, it's not my problem. You know, it's their problem, it's their job to get themselves out of that situation, just like I did. Okay? The other thing is that she was a very kind of decisive, strong woman, and she was very, very good at flirting. Very, very good at flirting. Her and Ronald Reagan, I know it's a bit disgusting, I'm sorry. Sorry to put that image in your mind. But her and Ronald Reagan themselves had a very close relationship. Some people even said that they had an uncomfortably close relationship because she would flirt all the time with him. She would smile sweetly at him. She would kind of toss her hair like that at Ronald Reagan. When she saw Gorbachev, she would kind of shimmy up to him a little bit, you know, make sure that her arm was touching his arm, just so that he knew that she was there. She was not afraid to use her own sexuality. You know, she may not have been the prettiest woman, but in political terms, she was considered quite sexy. Possibly because she was the only woman in government, but still, she was considered quite sexy. So, in 1979, which is when she gets into power first of all, this is her first government, she's in power 3 times, she comes into a country that is losing the will to live. You know, Britain is in absolute dire state. It's experienced something called the Winter of Discontent, which is a phrase taken from Shakespeare, and basically means that you're in absolute big doo-doo. And what happened in the Winter of Discontent is everybody decided they wanted to go on strike again. Because all the way through the 60s and 70s, the trade unions were running the shops, because the Labour and the Conservative governments had been following a policy of what we call consensus, which basically meant they just did the same thing as each other. And that meant not controlling immigration, it meant not doing anything really in terms of the trade unions, and so every time that they asked for wage increases, they were just like, oh, okay, here you go. Every time they went on strike, it was the government that folded. And what that did is it gave those trade unions a sense of confidence. It gave them a really inflated view of themselves. And Thatcher despised that. She really hated that. And she felt the economy was being run by these unelected trade union leaders rather than by our elected politicians. And that trade union power meant that people in the country were going on strike virtually every week. Billions and billions of pounds were lost every year because of strikes. And the Winter of Discontent was when they all did it, and basically nothing in winter got done. So if you were to walk through the streets of England in 1979, you'd have seen rubbish left on the streets, big piles of rubbish on the streets. Shops were closed, shops were boarded up. You'd even, if you decided to go to a graveyard, no way you'd do that just in your own time, but if you had, the graves were just left undug, because the grave diggers went on strike as well. So it was a really, really horrible situation. Inflation was very high, unemployment was through the roof. It was really, really high, and as we said, industrial unrest was getting out of control. Keynesianism was the policy that the government before Thatcher had adopted. Does anyone know what Keynesianism is? Great. I bet you do, you just don't want to say it because there's a camera at the back. But Keynesianism is basically when you invest and you invest and you invest and you throw lots of money at the economy in the hope that you will therefore generate growth. Okay? Now that's fine if you've got the money. The problem is if you don't have the money, you borrow the money, and you create a kind of a false image of an economy, and that economy eventually will start to collapse. She despised Keynesianism, and she wanted to go to a policy of what we call monetarism, which was being a lot stricter with the supply of money. Rather than throwing it at the economy, why don't we hold it back? Why don't we control that money supply and put it in little bits, dribs and drabs, and why don't we say where we put it? What's the point in giving it to Bob's Donuts when Bob's Donuts are rubbish? No one likes them and that business is going to close anyway. So we're not going to give them to Bob's Donuts, we're going to give them to Will's Wheels instead, because Will's Wheels are definitely going to work. So she was kind of picking and choosing. She was thinking, if we make businesses work for this money, we only give it to the businesses that will survive, then the businesses that are rubbish, they'll perish. But I don't care because they're rubbish anyway. What's going to be the immediate consequence of doing that? If you say that most of the businesses are rubbish and they can perish, when they perish, what is obviously going to happen? Will?
High unemployment.
High unemployment. But you can say that because your business is going to survive. But yes, high unemployment. And that is the obvious short-term consequence. But she thought, you know what, it's worth it. And it's a bit like an operation. You know, you go into an operating theatre, she saw the businesses as being kind of in dire straits, as being ill. You know, you do your operation, and if that person is strong enough, they'll survive. If they're not, then they won't. Okay, so there was an element of risk, but that was okay, because she felt that she would rather that was the case, then that patient, it sounds horrible, survive and need long-term care forever. Okay, because that's going to cost too much money. So, as we say, it had immediate negative effects. Okay, in her first government, she was very, very unpopular because of the refusal to prop these state industries up. The lending rate went up to 17%. At the moment, it's about 5%. The base rate of the Bank of England, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's still 0.5%. 17%. Now, if you're, getting a mortgage, we're talking tens of thousands of pounds. That's a huge amount of money. Huge social spending cuts. So she basically took the hospitals that good old Clement Attlee had helped create, and she just cut them. Okay, she didn't close them, obviously, because people need hospitals, but she cut the amount of spending she put in. She cut the amount of spending into education. She big time cut the amount of spending into welfare. She wasn't a big fan of Jeremy Kyle. Okay, she wasn't a big fan of that kind of welfare generation. She just cut it. So by 1981, the election, bear in mind, the next government is 1983, 3 million people are unemployed. Okay, although Daniel means that that's quite high. Okay, at the time, very, very unpopular. Looking great for Margaret Thatcher. It didn't matter how many times she flipped her hair in people's directions or she winked at the men in her ministry. It wasn't looking great for Margaret Thatcher. What happened then inside her government is they started to turn on her. Okay, and the factions inside the Conservative Party were called the wets and the dries. Okay, the wets were the wet blankets. Okay, the men who had no kahunas. Okay, who weren't willing to stand up to the unions, who weren't willing to take tough decisions. Unlike her, she had lots of kahunas because she was willing to do that. And the wets were starting to turn on them. They started to really focus on her womanness. Okay, the fact that she was, a little bit girly, and she wasn't doing very well because women can only cook and clean, and you shouldn't really let them into politics, and certainly don't let them drive a car. And it was that kind of sexism that was coming through in 1981 and 1982, really, as the economy was starting to look like it was failing, and that monetarism was not actually paying off. Huge, huge losses in by-elections. Look at this majority, from 19,000 to 5,000. The people of Great Britain were saying, enough of this woman, let's get some men back in. Then she got saved by a war. And it was the Argentinians that saved Margaret Thatcher's skin. I'm sure they won't appreciate being told that that's why they're famous in British history, that they saved her. And they saved her by invading the Falklands. Now, the Falklands was one of the last kind of colonial points of Great Britain. Now, we didn't really have an empire. Our empire had declined after the Second World War. But the Falklands was the one area that we really wanted to keep. It wasn't really that important. It was small. It wasn't really giving anything to the economy at all. But it was about status. Remember I talked about nationalism and pride, and the Falklands was about that status and that pride. And the Argentinians basically went in and tried to take the Falklands. Now, Margaret Thatcher, in true Elizabethan England style, jumped on a horse, not literally, and she said, this isn't going to happen. I have the body of a feeble woman and the heart of a warrior or something. Basically, she was going to kick their ass. And she did. And she sent the British Army in, despite opposition from her Foreign Secretary, who resigned, saying, oh, we can't do this, not another war, we've got to stop fighting people. Let's just have 50 years without killing anybody. She's like, no, that's boring. And so she sent the British Army in to sort these Argentinians out. I'm just going to show you a little clip, just to kind of summarise that problem. It was very important in saving this. intention. And advertising that just in case people who want to know about the falsehoods.
In 2011, the International
Some say it was the one single event that secured her re-election in 1983. Winning the Falklands War was indeed key for Margaret Thatcher, not least because it meant she lived up to her nickname, the Iron Lady. The conflict began on the 2nd of April when Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. In the UK, a political crisis followed. Ministers resigned because of Britain's apparent lack of preparation, but Mrs. Thatcher responded quickly. Within days she had dispatched 2 aircraft carriers, dozens of warships and thousands of troops. In the knowledge that these pictures would be broadcast in Argentina, Harrier jump jets and Sea King helicopters were left on the deck of HMS Hermes when they would normally be stored below. As the British ships began their 8,000-mile journey, Argentina swore in their own governor of the Falklands. The Royal Marines based on the islands were too small in number to put up any real resistance, and many were captured.
One always hopes for an early conclusion. One's learned throughout this whole Falklands campaign that things tend to take longer than you expect.
When the British ships finally got there, they set up a 200-mile exclusion zone around the islands. The Prime Minister gave permission for a nuclear sub to sink an Argentine cruiser, and 368 people were killed. Within days, though, the Royal Navy had suffered its own tragedy. HMS Sheffield was hit by an Argentine missile. It didn't explode, but it caused enough damage to completely disable and later sink the ship.
We feel great sympathy for our families, or rather the families of those of our friends on board who lost their lives during the attack.
The battle stepped up towards the end of May when British troops started conducting ground operations. It took them just 3 weeks to reach the capital, and Argentina formally surrendered on the 14th of June. 913 people had lost their lives.
We have ceased to be a nation in retreat.
Victory in the Falklands changed Margaret Thatcher's fortunes. Her popularity went from record lows before the conflict to a landslide election win in 1983. After the war, she dedicated lots of money to rebuilding the Falklands and visited the islands herself to see how her policy was being implemented.
Now let me have a look at that. There we are. Isn't that wonderful?
If one looks at it from the viewpoint of the Falkland Islanders, their loyalty is total. Their loyalty to our way of life, their loyalty to everything for which we stand. And time after time they come up and thank Britain for what she's done.
She remained popular with many who had served in the armed forces for the rest of her life. As a war leader, one famous former soldier described her as the best person you could have hoped for.
Okay, so as you can see, it's what we call the Falklands factor. It gave her her personality, her character, her reputation a real boost. Remember that the people in the Falklands wanted her to come and rescue them. They hated the Argentinians. Okay, most people, well, they do during the World Cups, they always win, but most people in the Falklands didn't like them at all. And so she was going in and liberating them from these oppressive South Americans. So it really, really gave her reputation a boost. £700 million was spent on the invasion of the Falklands, but at the end of the day, it won her really an extra 2 terms. It was well worth the money and well worth the deaths as far as she was concerned. So inflation, as she kind of wins the Falklands, the inflation starts to drop as well. The economy now starts to recover. The thing about monetarism is in the short term, everything just goes down the toilet. But in the long term, things start to climb out the toilet. So things start to get better, okay? And inflation went down from I think it was about 8 or 9%, and it went down and down and down to about 4%. This then started to control those 17% interest rates as well. The Falklands factor, as we said, gave her that little bit of boost. It made her also appear like she could handle things. Remember how I talked about how a lot of the kind of the people in her cabinet felt, you know, she could handle a Hoover and she could handle, you know, a cooker, but she couldn't really handle politics. You know, the Falklands was when she went into a war. She physically went into a war and she beat a lot of men. Okay, and that in itself kind of contradicted her feminine image, and that was very good because it meant she was still quite feminine for the female voters and the softer male voters, but she was still quite masculine for the more aggressive male voters. Okay. The other thing that she did that was also very popular by the time of that second election was the issue of the council houses. She wasn't anti-poor, regardless of what my mother would say. Okay, she wasn't anti-poor. She just didn't believe it was the job of the state to support the poor. And so she said to the poor, look, you're pretty poor, right? You don't have any money. You're in a bit of a naff situation. I understand because I was in your position as well. I'm going to give you the opportunity to climb out of it if you should choose to take it. You can buy your own council house. You can buy it at a reduced price, okay? Rather than kind of scrounging off the state, why don't you buy the house and therefore be independent of the state and make your own money just like I have done? And that was very, very popular with the working classes. And remember, the working classes were the support base of the Labour Party. And she was very, very shrewd in attacking that support base. She was clever enough not just to be a right-wing Tory. She was also a left-wing Tory when she wanted to be, particularly when there was election coming up. The other key thing is Labour themselves. Labour were appalling, absolutely appalling in the 1980s. They are the worst example of a political party, I think, of the whole of the 20th century. They were divided between the liberals in there and the really left-wingers. There were communists in the Labour Party who were talking about dissolving the state and setting up full nationalisation. Their leader, Michael Foot, was very left-wing. You know, he was part of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and he very famously released their manifesto in 1983 along these really left-wing lines: nuclear disarmament, you know, virtual full-scale nationalisation. I mean, that's crazy. You know, this isn't communist Russia. No offense, bringing the things in here. This isn't communist Russia. This is quite a centrist England, and they just completely missed the mark. And that election manifesto was called the longest suicide note in history, very famously, because it was such a disaster. So in many ways, that second election victory for Thatcher, which was a landslide victory, and she absolutely kicked their asses, proper kicked their asses, that landslide victory was partially because she was brilliant, partly because she killed lots of Argentinians, and partly because Labour just wanted to kill each other. There's lots of factors that were combined. But the key thing is the tide was turning around for Thatcher, and in 1983 she got into power with a comfortable majority, and she was now ready to really flex her feminine right-wing muscles. So the economy, 1979, 29.5 million working days are lost to strikes. By 1986, that goes down to 1.6 million. Because by 1983, she is now determined to really step on the union. She now has the mandate to do it. She hates the union. She hates everything they stand for. She hates the fact that they're men. She hates the fact that they're, like, militant. She hates the fact that they think they're better than her, because they're not better than her, because they're just unelected trade union officials. And so she starts to stand up to them, and every time they go on strike, she just sits down, folds her arms, and she thinks, I'll wait it out. Because while someone's on strike, they're not getting paid, and eventually they're going to have to be on strike. They're going to have to, end the strike. So she waits it out. 1975, inflation was 27%. 27%. And it goes down bit by bit, but that is absolutely enormous. It's down to 2.5% by 1986. the economy is starting to grow flowers. The green shoots of recovery have started when she got into power, but they're really starting to grow into beautiful roses. That's what, I suppose that's the way you could describe the economy. Not all of the economy is, but the bit that she cares about is. The stock exchange in the 1980s is starting to grow as well. This guy here is a member of the stock exchange. This is one of the very first mobile phones. Very, very large things. And the stock exchanges used to get them first. They used to walk through the streets of London with these great big bricks. I suppose they had to carry them in trolleys because they were so heavy. Drinking their champagne for their breakfast, wearing suits that were too big for them, but they still had these massive, pointless shoulder pads in them. Really kind of cocky, quite arrogant, very moneyed middle class. The people in the north were all just, their industries were dying, but this was the industry that she wanted to work, the banking sector, and they're called the yuppies. Have you heard of that phrase before? Okay, we have a lot today, but thank Margaret Thatcher for giving us the very first yuppies. And these are the yuppies down here as well. This is a real picture, okay? And they very, very famously would just spend their lives counting their money and drinking their champagne and living the high life. And that is the Margaret Thatcher class that she wanted to create. The other thing that she started to do as she got her mandate in 1983 is she started to kick in privatisation. She doesn't like nationalisation because obviously it means that the state is paying for things and controlling things. So she decided to start to privatise all the different industries. 14 major companies are handed to shareholders. The very, very famous one is BT. Okay, she basically put it on the stock exchange and she said to the people, buy a share in it and let's see it make money. It's not my job to make it money, it's your job. And therefore, what she was doing is she was dismantling essentially the state that had been in place really since 1945. She was picking apart the consensus that had existed before. Okay, and this continued all the way through Margaret Thatcher's government. Okay, go on. Okay, so we're just going to watch this quick clip now, and this is just talking about the way in which people still debate her kind of a polarising character as she starts to come up with more and more extreme policies.
Growing up to people with radically different viewpoints in New York. So New York is the former Conservative MP Louise Mensch. But first, joining us here in the studio, a man you've just seen in that film by Katie Razzle, Alexi Sale. And of course, in the end, she was God's gift to you.
She was, because I think of her as the first kind of modern personality disorder politician. I think that's why Blair is so caught up, because they're similar, they've got similar borderline narcissistic personality disorder, that she was just bonkers. I mean, she just seemed completely nuts. And when people abroad said, oh, you're represented by Margaret Thatcher, we were completely embarrassed if you were like a left-winger, because you thought, this woman is crazy, this woman is completely false, this woman has a complete kind of messianic sense of her own rightness, this, we are a grandmother. This is just a string of kind of cliches and prejudices strung together. It didn't mean she wasn't an effective politician, but it was just prejudice strung together as policy.
But, I mean, the fact is that you had something to kick against, but she won.
She never lost. Yeah, but what we had was a disaffected, minority, although, the majority of the country never voted for it, but what we had was, you had an audience in a club. Yeah, well, it's our democracy anyway, yeah, or democracy. But, Conrad, don't get me started. But, the Marxism. But, so you had these people in a club who hated it. And they had money and they had opinions and they came out and you could just, some nights you could just, if you weren't feeling like doing new material, you could just shout Thatcher's a bastard for 20 minutes.
Let's face it, you're more than her passing. There is nothing left now.
Well, actually, one of the things, I never, in the end, I never did that much material about Margaret Thatcher because I thought it was too easy. I blamed Ben Elton for all that. And everything else. So I think now, because the world is more bland, it makes you do more interesting material, I actually think.
Alexis, thanks for the moment. Now, Louise meant, obviously you'd have a very different picture, and I believe you came into politics actually precisely because of that.
I did indeed. My earliest political memory is about aged 8, asking my mother if men were allowed to be Prime Minister. Because I grew up seeing this woman running the country, and we had a Queen and we had a Prime Minister, and then later on Madonna was ruling the pop charts, and it all seemed like a very woman-dominated era. And I think President Obama was absolutely right when he said that she provided the example that shattered that glass ceiling for his daughters and all our daughters.
Aren't you and Alexis Sale, in fact, speaking to divided Britain?
I suppose so, but it's quite normal that a country as large as Britain isn't going to be united in its politics. I enjoyed Alexis Sale as a child of the 80s. I enjoyed watching Ben Elton riffing on a little bit of politics.
Okay, so as you can see, you know, for some people, well, for a comedian she was wonderful because she provided so much material, but for some people she was just those policies, those very extreme policies of privatisation, taking on unions, and very divisive, and they were wrong. And for other people, they were right. It was something that needed to be done. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't nice, it perhaps, you know, wasn't very feminine, but it had to be done because the economy needed to recover. So critics will claim, without those social policies, she took the fabric of Britain, she tore it apart. She said to the poor, you're poor, just go and be poor and shut up. She said to the rich, here's a mobile phone, here's, you know, the banking industry, here's some champagne, off you pop and go make loads of money. She tore apart the community of Great Britain because she was so intent on closing down the bits that she felt didn't work. The businesses that didn't work perished. The key thing that she really attacked, though, were the mines. Okay, the mining industry, which wasn't producing, it wasn't being effective. Up until this point, politicians had said, look, they basically operate in the whole of the north of England. Communities rely on mining. We can't just close them all down. Margaret Thatcher didn't give a rat's ass about that. She didn't care about the fact that the communities would be torn apart. She said, look, the economy needs to recover. Those communities eventually will benefit. These are the communities that were partying in the street when she died a couple of months ago. So the big thing, as I said, she takes on with the miners, and the big showdown is in 1984 with the miners' strike. And now this is the biggest showdown because it involved her really kind of face-to-face with Arthur Scargill. Arthur Scargill, as many people say, is the best thing that actually happened. The worst thing that happened to socialism, because he was such a monumental arse. Okay, he was such an arse of a leader. You know, he spent his whole time saying such ridiculous things, in such a ridiculous way, being so ridiculously uncompromising. And facing up to Margaret Thatcher, it was very easy for her to make him look like an arse because he was an arse. And in 1984, she stands up to him when he decides to call a strike. His biggest mistake, because he's an arse, is that he didn't do it properly. He didn't hold a proper ballot. So he basically told all the miners to go on strike when a lot of them would have voted against it anyway. It also meant he couldn't get the support of the Labour Party because it wasn't an official strike. So he basically thought he was Lenin, okay, organised this strike, got everybody to come out in the streets, and it lasted for a year. All these communities that were supporting it kind of came along and donated their cans of beans and their, you know, their Yorkshire tea bags, and they all sat in their little community halls on the strike. And after a few months, that was okay. You know, that was quite nice. It was a nice little kind of community. After about 6 months, it starts to get a little bit irritating because, of course, the people on strike aren't getting paid. So what starts to happen after 6 months is the strike starts to wobble. Okay, people start to leave the strike. We get people crossing the picket line. And Arthur Scargill starts to step up the kind of propaganda campaign. Oh, Margaret Thatcher's a witch, and Margaret Thatcher is a horrible person, and Margaret Thatcher doesn't care about us. We've got to get more and more militant. Again, thinking he was Vladimir Lenin, not really realising he was Scargill. SCARGILL was so over the top that he even decided to involve Gaddafi and Gorbachev in the miners' strike. He went to Gaddafi and Gorbachev and he asked them for money. So please, Mr. Gaddafi, since you are a genocidal despot, I think you might want to give me money for this strike. And Gaddafi does, he gives him tens of thousands of pounds to help him keep the strike going. Gorbachev doesn't give him money because Gorbachev gets flirted at by Margaret Thatcher, and he quite likes that. And he's got quite a good relationship with Margaret Thatcher. Not the kind of close relationship that Reagan has with her, but he quite likes her. Maybe a little bit too much, maybe in an inappropriate way, but he's not going to give money to SCARGILL. SCARGILL is not pretty enough for him to give money to. So Gaddafi gives him money, and it keeps the strike going for a little bit longer. But at the end of the day, after a year, the strike collapses. Margaret Thatcher has held out, and the reason why she was able to do that is because, as a very clever woman, she knew the strike was coming. So a year before the strike happened, she backed up all the coal reserves so that she had them in the bank, knowing that this strike would happen. So she wasn't affected by it. So as far as she was concerned, she just had to sit and wait for them to destroy themselves, and they did, and Arthur SCARGILL just disappeared into obscurity. Okay, and this is what she said about that miners' strike. We had to fight the enemy without in the Falklands. We always have to be aware of the enemy within, which is much more difficult to fight and much more dangerous to liberty. And this is why she didn't give in, because they were the enemy. They were trying to take down the system, and that's what Arthur SCARGILL said he was doing, and that's why he was nice. Because perhaps if he'd have gone at it in a bit more moderate way, he might have been able to get something. Perhaps if he'd have got the agreement of the Labour Party, it might have perhaps worked, but he didn't. He just went in thinking he was Lenin, and he lost. And she beat him quite monumentally. Okay, so we get to 1990, and Margaret Thatcher has now been in power since 1979. You know, her hair is still in place, she still looks quite strong. All the men around her think she's wonderful in a sense because, you know, she stayed in power and Labour are rubbish. And then she makes a huge, huge error. Does anyone know what that error is? Something that she decided to bring in.
Poll tax?
The poll tax. You know what the poll tax was? No? Anyone know what the poll tax was? Okay, when you get a job, okay, and you get a house, you will get, they'll tell you what your salary is going to be, and you'll be like, yes. And then you'll get your first pay packet, and you'll be taxed, and you'll feel like your life is over, okay? Part of that tax is called council tax, and it's basically depending on how much you earn, it depends on your status in terms of the salary pecking order. The poll tax was the opposite to that. The poll tax said, basically you all pay the same. So if you're earning £50,000 a year, you're paying the same amount of tax as somebody who's, you know, earning £5,000 a year. It's very, very unfair. I don't really understand why she thought it was a good idea. I don't know how much wine she'd been drinking the night she created the policy. It was a terrible idea, but she brought it in anyway, okay? It's just because I'm talking about Thatcher. She's watching us, I think. And she brought the poll tax in, and immediately people came out onto the streets, and it was incredibly unpopular. And people just couldn't take it. You know, they could take the bit where she wouldn't give money to the hospitals. That's okay, okay? They could take the bit where she destroyed all the miners. That's okay, because they're just the miners. But she can't take it when she's basically bringing in a tax. It is so ridiculous and so unfair. Everyone can see that it wasn't right. You know, everyone in her government told her not to do it. But Margaret Thatcher was a strong woman. She was used to being able to get her own way. She was used to being able to dictate the shots. And she wasn't about to be told by some two-bit man that her policy wasn't going to work, even if the two-bit man was correct. And so in 1990, that pressure on the street basically led to her resignation. Her party, the party that she had brought up from the gutter in 1979, finally turned on her. And John Major, who was instrumental in that defeat of Margaret Thatcher, turned on her and overthrew her, and then he became the leader of the Conservative Party. And trust me, if we were to do a lecture on John Major, it would be a lot shorter, because he didn't do very much at all. You know, he had a really tragic time, so tragic he had to occupy himself by having extramarital affairs, just to make his life a little bit more interesting. He's a very grey, very dull, very boring politician. We'll just watch a very, very short clip just to end, as she leaves her government and she leaves the country deciding whether she's the devil incarnate or the best thing that ever happened to feminism or politics.
News from the BBC with Philip Hayton.
Margaret Thatcher is resigning as leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. Before leaving Number 10 to see the Queen, she told her cabinet, "It's a funny old world." The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd will now stand in the second ballot. The Chancellor John Major also enters the leadership fray for what they both call a friendly contest. Michael Heseltine pays tribute to Mrs Thatcher's remarkable premiership. Labour's leader Neil Kinnock calls the resignation very good news and demands an immediate general election. Good afternoon. At 7:30 this morning, it's understood, Margaret Thatcher made up her mind. And at 9 o'clock, when senior ministers gathered around her at Number 10, she told them what she'd do. She'd remain Prime Minister only until Conservatives had elected a new party leader. She'd already informed the Queen by telephone that she wouldn't contest the second ballot next Tuesday. Mrs Thatcher said it was rather a funny old world when she'd won 3 elections for the Conservatives and she still believed she had the overwhelming support of Tories across the country. The reason for the Prime Minister's resignation, she said, was to enable cabinet colleagues to enter the ballot. Soon after 11 came the news that 2 senior ministers, Douglas Hurd and John Major, had joined the race. Including Michael Heseltine, there'll now be 3 candidates for Mrs Thatcher's job. Our first report is from our political correspondent, Lance Price, who's been in Downing Street all morning.
The first to hear of Mrs Thatcher's decision was her Parliamentary Private Secretary, Peter Morrison. He arrived at Downing Street at 7:30 this morning, shortly followed by John Wakeham, who early yesterday was appointed her campaign manager. By this time, the powers had been informed of her decision, but as cabinet ministers started arriving for their 9 o'clock meeting, it was clear that most were still in the dark.
It's still behind the Prime Minister.
Mrs Thatcher saw most of her cabinet individually last night. The majority told her that while they would continue to support her, they didn't think she could win.
Okay, just in the interest of time, I'll just end with my last slide, which is one of my favourite quotes about Tories. And it's just kind of summarising really the Tory party. No offence to anybody who is a Tory, which I suspect is quite a few of you based on how you're looking at me right now. Margaret Thatcher obviously left her government very famously crying because she was so hurt and upset by the way it happened. But I think what's interesting about Margaret Thatcher is that she really had the last laugh. Up to the bit where she died. Okay, before then she had the last laugh. And she had the last laugh because since then the Conservative Party have never really found anybody to capture the public imagination like she did. Because even if you hated Thatcher, you were talking about her. And David Cameron, no one really talks about him. He's just a little bit, wet, a bit slimy. No one trusts him. There's something odd about David Cameron. John Major is famous for, sleeping with somebody while he was in government. That is what he's famous for as he was Prime Minister. There isn't really, all the other Conservative leaders, you barely even remember who they are because they're not important. She has the last laugh because whether you loved her or you hated her, you knew who she was. So she's a bit, I suppose, like critical Marmite. On that note.